Okay, so this evening, I'm going to be talking about the circus story. Now, this is a genre that I think is regularly used to present controversial material to children. So this is probably not the first thing that comes to your mind when thinking about circus stories for children and young people. My topic is part of a much larger book project that looks at how circuses function in children's literature, past and present. It's a vast topic because the circus has been a consistently popular setting, theme, metaphor, and space in publishing for children from at least the 19th century. And writers, illustrators, and readers are attracted to it for a variety of reasons. My project maps the shifting cultural terrain across which circus stories move. It also takes into account that representations of the circus have never been the exclusive preserve of publications for the young. For instance, one of my central concerns in the book as a whole, not tonight, but in the book project, is the extent to which representations of the circus in works for the young share aesthetic and political interests and strategies with modernists and avant-garde authors and artists. Another of my interests is the metaphorical potential of circus stories in an age of constantly evolving technologies that are increasingly part of our lives and selves. Again, this is as relevant to adults as it is to children and young people. The shared audience for stories and images of circuses stems at least in part from the fact that circuses are hybrid spaces which mingle bodies, languages, sexualities, ethnicities, ages, classes, genres, discourses, animals and humans, the beautiful and the grotesque, possible and impossible feats, high and low arts, eroticism and glamour. This blurring of boundaries makes them innately transgressive. And when you add to these characteristics the fact that, as a rule, circus folk, the people who work in circuses, tend to be perceived as cultural outliers and often charged with having a relaxed attitude to laws and norms, there is clearly potential for circuses themselves to be controversial. Given this mixture of attributes and associations, there is much about circuses that goes against what is usually regarded as appropriate for children. Yet circuses are almost unfailingly regarded as suitable settings for stories aimed at even very young children. So tonight, I'm exploring the extent to which circus stories may confront, but also often disguise, erase, and make acceptable damaging and disturbing ways of treating children. Despite their diversity, circus stories need to be understood as constituting a distinct genre with a clear set of conventions. So, for instance, the action almost invariably begins with the arrival of the circus, and it focuses on the impact of the circus on a local child or a small group of children. The first form of impact is the way a circus vanquishes tedium, the tedium restrictions, and in some cases, even the privations of childhood. From the bright posters announcing that a circus is coming, to the circus parade and culminating in performances under the big top, the quotidian world becomes secondary. Circus stories deal in an environment that is exotic, polyglot, international, and carnivalesque. In children's books about circuses, what is more important than the exotic animals, the astonishing illusions, the gravity-defying aerialists and acrobats and antic behavior of adults in the roles of clowns are the juvenile performers. These apparently exceptional versions of themselves, who seem to be valued parts of the exclusive circus family, arouse a complex mixture of desires and emotions, which give rise to another staple of the genre, children who run away to join the circus. What happens to those who succeed in being taken on is rarely what they expect, however. And so the controversial aspect of circus stories I will be talking about this evening relates to this seductive aspect of circuses and the way child bodies are shown to be acquired, disciplined, used, and displayed across a selection of circus stories. The distinguished social and cultural historian Carolyn Steedman has identified the most referred to, represented, and transmogrified child figure of the 19th century as Mignon, the girl acrobat who features in Book 1 of Goethe's Wilhelm Meister. Indeed, Steedman claims that the androgynous 13-year-old acrobat haunted the 19th century. Although part of a traveling troupe of acrobats rather than a fully fledged circus, Mignon's fascinating body, history, and the suffering she endures at the hands of her trainers underpinned campaigns to protect child circus artists and other child performers. Apart from the sentiments aroused by Mignon's haunting presence, one reason why Victorian reformers concentrated on rescuing circus children was the recognition that such children were especially vulnerable due to the peripatetic nature of circuses. Their constant travels meant that little was known about the origins and living conditions of circus children. And even when concerns were raised, such children were difficult to find and rescue. The circus was always on the move, and it could hide up in different places if they felt they were being scrutinized. So these children flew beneath the official radar very often. Particular anxiety centered on juvenile circus acrobats because of the harsh training regimes used to turn an ordinary child's body into something extraordinary. These were detailed in studies and exposés, such as Ellen Barlee's Performing Waifs of 1884, which explains that training began very young because then alone, before their bones and muscles have attained firmness and strength, before the frame is knit, can the bones be rendered sufficiently supple to perform the duties required of them. And I think you see in this actually Norwegian painting of a child being displayed to a circus master, that these children were often treated as little more than animals or sideshow exhibits. The child is undernourished and being made to display himself to see if they can get work for the whole family. And his trainer is there with a stick of some kind, coercing the child to perform. The reforming journalist Henry Mayhew, known for his 1851 survey of the working population of London, was another who provided detailed descriptions of the training endured by juvenile acrobats, helping to make the campaign one of interest across the whole of British society. The Acrobats Bill was brought before the British Parliament in 1872. When presenting that bill, Lord Shaftesbury read from a letter by a 17-year-old acrobat whose training began when he was 2. This is what he says: "My father trained me into it. He began by twisting my limbs and backbone when I was a little baby. I used to suffer dreadful, and I remember when I was from 4 to 9 years of age, he used to make me twist myself and remain twisted up till my bones seemed to come away from each other, and I was often ill with the pain." That bill was unsuccessful, but the campaign continued and finally succeeded in 1879. It is against this background that we must read books such as The Little Acrobat and His Mother, which you can just make out the title. It's the red book in the middle of the slide, of 1872, in which a harsh mother subjects her son to just such a routine and also deprives the boy of food to keep his body weight low, just as we saw in that painting. There were many others, including Acrobat's Girlhood of 1889 by the best-selling author Hesba Stretton, Francis Stratton's Nan the Circus Girl, you see here on the right, of 1898, and a pair of books, each called The Runaways, one by Mrs. O.F. Walton of 1873, and another by Sidney Gray of 1884. Gray's is the grayish book on the left here called The Runaways. These books feature children like Mignon trapped in abusive regimes as circus performers. In them, the circus is a place of cruelty and abuse, and far from running away to the circus, the children flee from them. Sidney Gray's book is typical and is part of an attractive but very inexpensive series published by the Religious Tract Society. It was intended to reach out to mass audiences. The Religious Tract Society was a major British publisher of Christian literature for children, women, and the poor. It also supplied books to support missionary work in cities and overseas. So these books cost very, very little, and they could be expected to reach readers at all kinds of levels in society. Gray's The Runaways tells of brother and sister Jack, who's 10, and Mags, age 7, known to the circus-going public as Giacomo and Mademoiselle Marguerite. Despite their exotic names, the two are emphatically identified as British. Their recently deceased mother, who made costumes for the circus, came from Glasgow in Scotland. Their father, who is also dead, was English. While a great many circus children were actually abducted from other countries, local prejudice was inclined to construct foreign children as knowing and sexually precocious, and so less in need of aid than British children. Jack's and Mag's Britishness is used as a marker of their purity and a vehicle for arousing sympathy for them, and by extension, for real children in similar situations. For the same reason, arousing sympathy, and in keeping with the Religious Tract Society's ethos, it's made clear that their education has been as neglected as all their other needs. So they're really unsuited for managing in the world. The children are illiterate, but instinctively devout. Before her death, their mother taught them a few hymns and prayers, which they recall on the night they decide to run away. They assure each other that the God their mother believed in loves them and will look after them when they leave the circus behind. With a view to enlisting help for the campaign to rescue circus children, Gray's young circus performers are shown to be helpless. They have no protector or guide and are entirely at the mercy of tyrannical and abusive adults. Jack, for instance, is brutally beaten by the circus owner most days. The children finally decide to run away when the owner kicks and fatally injures their small dog, the last to their mother. Running away is the extent of their agency, however. In these books, circus children are victims who must be rescued by middle-class philanthropists, just as Mignon is rescued by Wilhelm Meister. Mags and Jack's saviors come in the form of a wealthy family whose house they chance upon as they tramp towards London in hope of finding work. The family had been to see the circus when it visited their town a few days earlier, and they recognized the children. The circus children had, in fact, made a particularly big impression on the much-loved and well-cared-for disabled daughter of the house. Watching the circus, she had longed to be a performer like Mademoiselle Marguerite. But as they come to understand the reality of the lives behind the gaily dressed young performers that they had applauded so enthusiastically, families are encouraged to question their own complicity in what has happened to Jack and Mags and all the other children like them. The wealthy household takes the orphans in, begins to educate them, and helps the children make contact with a long-lost uncle in Scotland. The uncle and his wife are childless and happily welcome the children to their home. And since that was their dying mother's last wish, this is a very happy ending to an otherwise rather distressing book. Now, there are many similarities between these British circus stories that I've talked about and the approach to the genre in the United States. The best-known American circus story of the 19th century was James Otis Kaler's Toby Tyler, or 10 Weeks with the Circus of 1881. Kaler cornered the U.S. market in circus stories, writing a total of 7 between 1880 and 1911. Of these, Toby Tyler was far and away the most successful, reprinted 7 times in Kaler's lifetime and several times since. It reached new audiences through a Disney adaptation in 1960. As well as following genre convention, Kaler added to them, starting with details of how the young Toby is enticed to join the circus by false promises. This becomes a regular thing. And often, Toby is being raised by an uncle who mistreats and overworks him. The boy joins the circus on the promises of a Mr. Lord who has a stall selling sweets. He promises the hungry little boy he will be able to eat some of the treats he would be selling. Toby soon discovers, however, that life in the circus is even harder than it was on his uncle's farm. Mr. Lord thrashes him every morning before breakfast, and when the circus manager decides Toby should become a bareback rider, performing dangerous stunts on horses, his training is as brutal as those of child acrobats in British stories. Like Jack and Mags, he decides to escape. With nowhere else to go, he runs back to his uncle. Now, things turn out well for Toby because his absence has worked a transformation on Uncle Daniel. Toby is now loved and safe, giving the story a very, very American twist. Applied himself to the work he's given and learned new skills. Toby is now strong, independent, and successful. Needless to say, the happy ending sets the tone for the Disney version, which was a lively, cheerful production in which the circus is largely a place of delight and achievement. Disney had already had success with another circus-based animated cartoon, Dumbo, in 1941. And this seems to be a turning point in the presentation of circuses as jolly places for all the family. Nevertheless, it's notable that up to this point in the history of circus stories, happy endings involve children escaping from rather than running away to circuses. And this takes us further into controversy. In the early stories, we get some explanation of why children are so unhappy. Much is made of the beating, starving, and regimes that make the children desperate. But the questions must also be asked about what is not said around the way children's bodies are made to fulfill the demands of the adults who control them. This silence may in part arise from an actual blind spot. Before the 20th century, the sexual abuse of children was not something that featured in the public consciousness. Indeed, the term pedophile was first used in 1900. While the terminology may have been lacking, the phenomenon of adult interest in child bodies was not unknown. The early days of circus stories coincided with the rise of spectators who were sexually aroused by watching child acrobats and other juvenile performers. Steedman calls the late 19th century, and this is a quote, the age of the connoisseur for acrobats and aerialists. These fans generated what she calls an aestheticized physiology around the performers' bodies. Children were as vulnerable to being preyed on as those who paid to watch them as they were by those who managed them. And arguably, this remains the case. In our own time, there are many stories of young athletes, skaters, and dancers who were sexually abused by their trainers who controlled their bodies and careers. So here you see some of the gymnasts from the U.S. Olympic squad who've spoken out about their own mistreatment at the hands of those who are meant to care for them. Once the specter of the various kinds of abuse young circus performers routinely suffered, whether by trainers or from those who paid to have access to them, once that's raised, even the simplest, most cheerful seeming circus story may take on controversial dimensions. Look, for instance, at Circus Time by Maury. Now, this is the only version of the book that I can find. It's in Britain, it appeared, it seems, in 1964. But from the clothes and style, it looks to me as if it's been imported and translated from some part of Europe. And I'd be very interested if any of you can give me some more information about this book. And I need to apologize in advance for the images of this and the next book that you're going to see. I took them at the British Library just using my phone for reference. I planned to go back and get better scans, but of course the lockdown meant that the British Library was closed and I was not able to buy copies of the book. So you're having to look at rather poor quality images, I'm afraid. Anyway, this book introduces us to two poor children, Jack and Susan. You can see they're dressed in rags here, and they're watching from outside as the circus arrives and the circus parade comes through their tiny little village. And you can see straight away that there's an emphasis on youth in the circus parade. There's a little drummer boy, and even the lions are baby lions in the picture. Now, Jack and Susan are approached by the circus director, who is also the circus clown, and he seems very friendly. He entertains them, and he says he'd like to give them a treat. So he invites them behind the scenes in the circus and gives them fancy new costumes to wear, and gives them a really entertaining afternoon before providing them with front row seats at the circus. There they see all the lights that you normally associate with the circus, the exotic animals, the crazy clowns. But what they particularly notice is the graceful little dancer, Mary, there on the bareback rider on the horse. Okay. They think she is just marvelous. But of course, all good things come to an end, and that is the nature of circuses and carnivals. They move on, and poor Jack and Susan are very sad to think that their new friends will be leaving them behind. But the circus director comes and says they needn't be left behind. If they'd like, they can join the young drummer boy and graceful little Mary in the circus caravan and go off away with them, never to be seen in their hometown again, presumably. Now, that leaves us with a question. Is this quite simply a marvelous kind of Cinderella tale about kind circus folk who rescue neglected children and give them exciting lives? Or, knowing the fate of so many fictional circus children, are we justified in suspecting that the problems of this pair may just about to become greater? It's not necessary to read the story as one of entrapment. But once you do, it becomes controversial in several ways, since there's no sense in which this is offered as a cautionary tale. Readers are encouraged to feel happy for Jack and Susan, perhaps even to envy them. This is the kind of story that feeds dreams of running away to join the circus, promising child readers that if they were to be accepted into the circus family, they would become glamorous, exceptional, and enviable. Arguably, then, such stories participate in the procurement of vulnerable children, or at least the tendency for readers and spectators to assume complacently that the smiling performers are having a splendid time, as they did in Sidney Gray's The Runaways. Now, the same issues persist throughout the 20th century, including in nonfiction works. For example, Bill Kremitz's A Very Young Circus Flyer of 1979 is made up of photos and interviews with a real circus family, the Flying Farfans. The acknowledgement reads, "What an admirable family, and how proud I am to know them." But they are admirable in the sense that they are a hardworking, loving family. There is no indication that Tato, the book's 9-year-old protagonist who you see here on the cover, is being physically or sexually abused by his parents or other members of the circus. His ambition and commitment to learning the family trade seem genuine and are impressive. But what else can he do? There is much in the text that is disturbing at the level of the opportunities and choices available to Tato, the impact on his body, the way he is trained to dress to display his body, and how far his rights to education, safety, and the kind of childhood freedom of his non-circus peers are being respected. This is a story of a child for whom the circus is home, school, and playground. One of the first things we learn about Tato is that he comes from a long line of circus performers, and that is very common. It's a tradition to pass on particular kinds of skills. In this case, his father's family came from a circus in Chile and his mother from what was then Czechoslovakia. From birth, his destiny has been to be a circus performer. He's been flying since he was 4 years old, and his 5-year-old cousin is soon to make her debut. Although mention is made of doing homework because they're always on the road. And this is a quote. He says, "We travel about 15,000 miles a year, and last year we visited 52 cities. There is no obvious opportunity for a formal education. No mention is made of traveling tutors or teachers or homeschooling. Add to that, when the daily routine is set out, schooling is not mentioned, and there seems to be no time when it could actually take place." Many of the things that concerned 19th century activists about what circus training required of child bodies also apply to this boy. For instance, unlike most children, he is not pleased when he is measured for new costumes and discovers he has grown, because "my dad is hoping I'll stay small to make it easier to catch me." He rarely gets to watch the other acts, as he's required to do long hours of training. In the season, they train in the morning, 2 shows a day, and then spend 2 hours training after the evening performance. In the off-season, we, the quote, "just have to rehearse from 9 to 5, and then we're free." It's about the only time we get to go out at night and do things, because after the season starts, we have so many evening shows. Although the book makes little of the rigors of the training regime, Tato casually remarks that his father gets very angry when he makes mistakes or has to be told repeatedly what to do, and that "I have marks all over my hands where Poppy," which is what he calls his father, "catches me but can't hold on because my wrists are too." Compared with circus children in the 19th century novels, Tato often has a reasonable life. He seems proud and happy to be a member of the circus. Nevertheless, as with Maury's Circus Time in Kremitz's book, the circus setting Mark makes is in fact a very hardworking and in many ways a limiting life seem glamorous and attractive. Nimon's hold over the 19th century imagination wasn't solely to do with her vulnerability and pathos. Goethe's account of Wilhelm Meister's attraction to Mignon is undoubtedly bound up with the exotic and erotic fascination of being allowed to gaze on her body in public performances, where she does what he is incapable of imagining a body to do. Goethe writes, "Wilhelm could not look at her enough. His eyes and his heart were irresistibly fascinated by the mysterious condition of this being. He kept on looking at her." A century and a half later, the founder of post-colonial theory, Edward Said, then between 9 and 10 years old and living in Egypt, recalls being similarly drawn to the pages in Collins' junior book of knowledge featuring Kalita, a girl fakir in the Bertram Mills Circus. In his memoir, Said describes how Kalita's contortions were captured in tiny, grainy, and blurred photographs. He is intrigued by her unfamiliar 2-piece costume, but particularly struck by the, and this is a quote, "amazing, unimaginable things she did with her body." Kalita's behavior defied the laws of respectability and decency in 1940s Cairo and many other parts of the world for most boys and girls. Her exploits, including wearing a bathing suit and carrying a fearsome-looking crocodile, excited him. He, quote, "dreamed of knowing her, being taken into her caravan, being shown more feats," end quote. Just as much as if he were watching in the circus ring, the young Said is allowed to gaze on the body of another child whose life is exceptional enough to be included in a children's encyclopedia, but whose deportment and assumed experience are only acceptable in the circus context. The same is true of Tato. The text reports the kind of knowledge he has, which, like Kalita's costumes, would be considered unsuitable for most 9-year-olds. His parents dressed themselves and their children in the revealing costumes associated with acrobats and aerialists. He wears hairspray and makeup, and the only cultural references he seems to have outside the circus are to such things as film. He mentions Burt Lancaster kissing Gina Lollobrigida in the movie Trapeze, for instance. On his evenings off in the winter training camp, Tato plays arcade games, especially pinball machines. Just 5 years older, his brother rides a motorcycle, hangs out with the showgirls, and is generally unsupervised. But there isn't much time for these activities because there are the other tasks that come with being a child circus performer: photo shoots, interviews, fan mails. fan mail and queuing with the adults to collect a weekly paycheck. It's not just when they are paid that Tato's life overlaps with those of the grown-ups around him. He has no separate world of childhood and finds his friends among the caged animals. Now, circuses have changed a great deal since Krementz's book, but the circus story persists in being told and in featuring children whose lives seem less than ideal. Since the turn of the millennium, there's been a wave of circus novels, many of them built around elaborate fantasy worlds. These too normalize and glamorize childhoods that are disturbing or controversial, as we're thinking tonight. My final example comes from Erin Morgenstern's crossover novel, The Night Circus of 2011. Now, the plot of this book centers on a contest between two children, Celia and Marco, set up by two rival magicians. Celia and Marco are trained for the competition for several years, and though they learn to do astonishing things, the training is isolating and brutal. Marco, for instance, is locked in his room for months on end to read and study. Meals are delivered to his door, but he rarely speaks with another human being. And when his master takes him out, it is always only for educational purposes. Celia is the illegitimate daughter of her master, but he shows her no affection. Indeed, both children are repeatedly and seriously abused, starting with the moment when each is bound to their master magician by a ring that painfully burns through their skin, leaving a vivid scar. Celia's talent lies in breaking and repairing things, and so her father repeatedly breaks her bones and systematically harms her in other ways to teach her how to mend living bodies. Here's a scene from early in the book. Prospero the enchanter uses a pocket knife to slit his daughter's fingertips open, one by one, watching wordlessly as she cried out until calm enough to heal them, drips of blood slowly creeping backwards. Celia's shoulders fall, releasing the tension that is knotted in them, her relief palpable as she draws herself safely together. Her father gives her only moments to rest before slicing each of her newly healed fingers again. Despite these distressing scenes, the book's paratext includes a great many quotations from reviewers deeming the book enchanting and crediting it with bringing happiness. It is as if, in the interests of making them ready to perform in the night circus, it is legitimate to treat these children cruelly. As long as the show goes on, it seems not to matter what happens under the big top when audiences are not looking. And so, while circus stories have never been classified as controversial, I think it's time to consider whether at least some of them should be. Certainly, it seems we need to look more closely at how the lives of children who fascinate and thrill the paying public are presented to child readers. And that is where I end for tonight, but I do have a request. I'm looking to make this project as international as possible. And so far, I've gathered stories and background material from books from Scandinavia, India, Belgium, and Italy, as well as Anglophone countries. And I'd be really grateful if any of you have suggestions for stories from wherever you're from, Poland, of course, but I know many of you are listening from elsewhere. Given my limited language skills, picture books are probably best for me, but I would love to know about the kinds of circus stories that made an impression on you or that you have come across as scholars. So thank you very much for listening.